Butter?
Hello,
No,
and
it's an
welcome
actual
to this
diamond.
talk about
Any
mod
other
manager
questions?
development at Nexus Mods. My name is Tim Baldrich, and I'm going to also known as Helgari online, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about my work at Nexus Mods and what we're building. First of all, a little bit about myself. As I said, my online name is Helgari. I'm the team lead of desktop application development at Nexus Mods, and it's a terribly long name, but essentially what it means is that I'm in charge of help of designing and building the applications that will run on your system. This is opposed to the back-end web services team or the front-end, website team. We work primarily with applications that you download and install. I have roughly 30 years of experience in software engineering. 20 of that is professional. And my most recent experience is in large distributed applications, logic engines, programming languages, that sort of thing. And I've kind of used that knowledge of how things are done on a broader scale in software engineering. And I like to condense that down into useful use cases for modding as well. And so back in 2019, I started Wabajack as a way to bring some of these concepts of software engineering and use them to solve the problem of like automatic mod installation and that sort of thing. So about a year ago, I was tasked with building a team that would be the app team at Nexus Mods. And so we hired several people, and I want to introduce these people to you now. Now, I'm going to use their online names so we don't end up, putting real names out on Twitch or YouTube or wherever this video is going to go. And so one of the first people we hired was Sewer56. He wrote the Reloaded Mod Manager, which is a mod manager that primarily is designed for Sonic and Persona games. There's lots of low-level optimization experience that he has and knowledge of assembly language, function hooking, that sort of thing. We also hired Airy 120, and he worked with me many, many years on Wabajack. Probably, aside from myself, he has the most code contributions to Wabajack, and he knows a lot about .NET in general. I tend to be a bit of a polyglot. I hop programming languages every few years, and so it's great to have someone who knows a little more than me about the best practices in .NET and kind of the right way to do things. We also hired Al, who was a lead developer for many years on Mod Organizer 2, and really has a lot of great experience with organizing communities, mod managers, and just software development, and it's great to have him on the team as well. We also have Simon on the team, who is a former Unity developer, and he maintains Vortex, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And working with him is Nagev, who worked on Vortex on and off for many years and is now an official long-term member of the team. So what are Nexus's goals in this space? Really, I guess, what are Nexus's high-level goals? Why do we build desktop application software, right? Well, one of the main reasons is to make modding easier and to get more people involved in the hobby. You can imagine a company that does what we do and hosts mods. It is beneficial for us to have more people involved. And so really anything that we can do that kind of gets more people wanting to mod, to experiment with new games and new mods is great for us. It's kind of a mutually beneficial situation. We get more customers, you get more products and more services that we can build because we have the resources to do so. But why make a mod manager in particular? Well, modding can be daunting for new users. It may start simple and put some mods in this folder, but once you start to get large numbers of mods, hundreds of mods, or in the case of Bethesda games, thousands of mods, it can be pretty daunting to know what to install when and in what order and what way. And I kind of believe that mod managers should be accessible for new users, but yet powerful for experienced users. I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. It's certainly hard to build both into an application, but they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Another thing is that many of us, the employees of Nexus Mod, want better tools, and we want to dog food our own tools. Dog fooding is a term that's used in software engineering to kind of mean, if you're making dog food, do you feel good enough about the product you make to eat the dog food yourself? Well, it's probably a bad idea to eat dog food in any case, but would you feed the dog food to your own dog, right? Would you subject someone to the product you are making and selling, right? And we really want to be dog fooding our own products. If we use a mod manager, we want to be using one that we built so that we know where the pain points are and that sort of thing. And many of us on this application team, the names you saw earlier, are people that joined because we were already doing this as a hobby. And now we have a way of doing this for a living. And it's really what we want to do. And we want to push the community forward and really build a solid product. And this is a way for us to do that. One of the things I want to mention is that open source is really important to us at Nexus Mods, especially when it comes to desktop applications. Open source, I believe, is a critical part of modern desktop software development. Now, this doesn't mean that every company should be forced to open source their code, but I think it's a good thing if they do. It offers a bit of accountability to users and auditability so that the users can say, you know what, there's a lot of my CPU being used right now. Well, what's this thing doing? And they can go look at the source code if they know how, or ask a friend or trust someone else to say, hey, what is this application doing when it's using all my cores and all my RAM? Is it a good thing? Is it actually making efficient use of the resources, or is it doing something else, right? And really also being open source ensures that the community's work, their contributions to that program are not lost in the case of the company being bought or shutting down or something like that. We don't plan on going anywhere soon, but if something were to happen to the Nexus, the work that we do would not be lost in the desktop space. And a lot of the important parts of the applications that we build for the desktop use are based on open source libraries, and we want to contribute back to that ecosystem. We got something for free, we're building something, we'd like to also give that for free and continue that tradition. And so all of the Nexus Mods desktop software is GPL3 open source, and this is something I believe really strongly in. Like I said, if other people choose not to open source their software, it doesn't make them bad. It's just something I believe strongly in, and something that the Nexus does as well, is that we want our desktop software to be open source. So what about Vortex, right? So let's talk a little bit about this. Let's see, Vortex was designed primarily as a hub or shell application. And the core of Vortex is actually pretty small. And all these extensions plug into it to build out the functionality needed to mod a modern game. But it was developed primarily at a time when the Nexus wasn't prepared to maintain an entire team of developers working every day on the application. And so it was designed primarily for a single developer and a lot of community support. One person making the shell and kind of coordinating, and everybody else contributing into it. But over time, the resources and the priorities have changed. As I mentioned before, mod managers are kind of critical to the Nexus's plans for how we want to support the community. And so it's important for us to have a high quality mod manager that we can maintain and we can support. And so we decided to build the Nexus Mods app. One of the first things, as I mentioned, is we've hired a team of people. It's no longer just one person working by themselves. There's 4 people working full time, and as time goes on and we start to deprecate Vortex, we'll roll more people onto this team. So the Nexus Mods app, I understand, I agree, it's not a cool name, it's not a flashy name, it's not, Vortex 2 or the Conflux or whatever name you want to come up with. It's boring, but it is very descriptive, and that is the app that you use to access the Nexus Mods. It is a ground-up development of a new mod manager. It leverages a larger team of people. We are starting with more people and building it with that idea in mind that we don't need to be so concerned about maintaining this small core because we actually have several people working full-time every day working on this project. It takes advantage of modern hardware developments. A lot has changed in the hardware space since Vortex originally was developed, and we have a lot more cores in systems. We have faster hard drives. We have, all sorts of things we can take advantage of. And that doesn't mean necessarily that we will, the app is necessarily going to be heavier or it won't work well on lower end systems. But we want to just not leave that potential performance lying on the floor. We want to scale with the hardware that the gamers and the hobbyists are using. So we want to develop this in hand with the community, but maintenance will be the responsibility of my team at the Nexus Mods. The buck stops here is the saying that I like to use here. See, 100-something years ago here in America, when people played poker, they would have this puck that would pass around, and that was who was dealing, and you would pass the puck to the next person to be the dealer, and if you didn't want to deal, you would just pass it on to the next person, right? And Many years ago, there was a president who had a thing on his desk that says the buck stops here. And the idea there is that some person has to take responsibility. Some person has to say, this thing is broken, this thing needs to be fixed. I will be the one that bears that burden, if you will. And we want to be that for the app, right? We want community contributions. We want to work with the community. But once the code gets into our code base, if it breaks, we need to be the first line of support on that to say, hey, it's broken, we're going to fix it. If someone else in the community wants to say, oh, I got that, I'll fix it, fantastic. But we're the ones working full time on it. It should primarily be our responsibility. So, software stack, let's talk a little bit about that because it does matter here. The app is written in C# and on .NET. I don't know that many people know, but over the past 7 years or so, the cross-platform story on C# has gotten way better. It runs on mobile devices, it runs on OS X, Linux. You can install it just about anywhere, even into a web browser these days. And so that is a really critical thing for us. We didn't want to have to switch languages or use a language that only works on one platform. It needs to be cross-platform. C# is also extremely fast. Properly optimized, it can be as fast as C. Now, there's reasons why you maybe have a lesser opinion of it in video games. But video games are a little bit different than a desktop application. And so, when we need to, we can optimize C# to the point that we can get C-level performance. And when we don't need that, we can have all the other fantastic benefits of C# without having to switch between languages, writing part of the app in, let's say, C or C++, and the other part in a different language. C# also has fantastic development tools. It's been around for decades at this point, used by gigantic companies all over the world, and so when we need tools, they exist. We're using the Avalonia framework. Now, anyone who's worked in C# probably understands this as the weak spot of .NET, and that all the UI toolkits are either outdated or deprecated or dead or whatever. Microsoft seems to want to invent a new UI toolkit every couple of years, and each one seems to be worse than the one before. But Avalonia is a community project. It's cross-platform, ticks all the boxes there, and it's really one of the best UI toolkits I've used. It's not the best, but it's one of the best. And so it works well for us, and that's what we're moving forward with. I want to mention here that the app we're building is a native desktop application. There's no Electron shell. We're not loading up Chrome and loading our app inside it. We're not building the backend in one language and the front end in JavaScript. There's no web app layer. There's no always online component. It's a desktop application. That's the way I believe that these mod managers should be written, and that's the way we're writing this one. So let's talk a little bit about OS X support, right? Or OS support. We'll talk about OS X support in a second. Let's talk about OS support. We're basing this on the idea that most gamers are going to use Windows 10 Plus. It's the first target we kind of go for with all our features. Most gamers use Windows. Older versions than Windows 10 are not supported by Microsoft even, and they're not supported by us with the app. By the time we actually get to a full release and a beta release, that sort of thing, this story will be even further down the road. And so there's really no reason for us to support Windows 7 or 8 or XP. Linux support is actively developed and maintained. 2 of our developers daily drive Linux and develop the app on Linux, Arch Linux. If you ask them, they'll tell you it's Arch. If you don't ask them, they'll probably still tell you it's Arch. But yeah, Linux is great. Also, Steam Deck came out a couple years ago now, I guess, and that has rapidly increased the demand for modding on Linux, and we want to really support that. And so, that's kind of critical. OS X support is coming soon, and I'll explain what I mean about that in a second. There's been an increased demand for OS X support thanks to games like Baldur's Gate and Stardew Valley having native versions for OS X. Excuse me. But also what we're seeing is that there's increased efforts by Apple to encourage gamers to go on and to game on a Mac. And whether this continues in the future, whether this means more native ports or a Wine-like interop layer, I don't know, but we'll keep a good view of it. But really it's this first part here that some of our really popular games on the Nexus have Mac support, and we would like to support that. We'll definitely be adding official support for it. Right now, it's kind of in the place of when we get free time, we'll finish the last little bits of porting the code over. There's some interop that needs to be handled. But aside from that, 90% of our code already runs on OS 10. We just kind of got to do the last little bit. Mobile and VR operating systems are not planned at this time. And what I mean by VR operating systems are versions of Android or things like that, or Apple, I guess, has one now that run within your VR headset. We certainly support VR games, but they are the tethered version that requires a PC, right? There may be more demand for this in the future, and we'll look at it at that point. But right now, these market segments are too small, and the technical difficulties are too high. When it comes to display size, we really are trying to develop for multiple display sizes at once. It's designed around the idea that most users will be working on 1080p or 1440p, but we want it to run on a Steam Deck as well. So we got to size it down to 800p or 720p. In fact, a lot of our designs that we do, we design it at the larger size, scale it down, make sure it still works, and go from there. And you can see here, I actually have a Steam Deck, and I'll hold this up, that, the app runs right now on Steam Deck, and you can, kind of click through the different screens. So this is the main branch of our app running on a Steam Deck, and that's cool to see. But one of the other things we're doing is designing this to work on ultra-wides via panels and multi-window support. So if you look here at this mock-up, and I want to mention here that you'll see some screenshots. Almost all of these are mock-ups, and so a lot of the text is stubbed out. This is what we're using as we're building this functionality to kind of get an idea of what it will look like. This could change. Don't read too much into it. It will change probably dramatically. The overall theme may not, but right now what we're talking about is these kind of panels and workspace views. So we build our tools out with panels, and we want to make it so you can organize those panels into tabbed views or a workspace laid out, as well as multi-window support so that you can have multiple windows if you have multiple monitors, and each one of those can have multiple panels and tabs and that sort of thing. And if that's too daunting, don't worry about it. You can work with one, or if you want two panels, or if you want, put it on a Steam Deck. That's kind of our design, is to make it flexible enough so that it works well for the new users, but powerful enough that if you want to, you could create an entire integrated development environment for building your mods. So let's talk about file deployment. One of the first things when building a mod manager is how do we install the files and how do we maintain them? And I want to break here real quick and say, I understand that this talk doesn't have a lot of flashy graphics, a lot of gameplay in the background. I probably have a droning voice. In general, this entire talk is probably about as lifeless as Nazim's marriage. But stick with me. There's some kind of cool tech, some cool tidbits, and hopefully, my enthusiasm for this is enough to keep everyone interested, at least for the next half hour or so. So, file deployment. It's a big problem in mod managers, and let's talk about how we might solve that. How do we install these files and maintain them? Users who first start modding just throw the files into their game folder. But this is generally considered a bad idea for several reasons. Vortex hard or soft links files into the game folders today. And we'll talk about that as well. Mod Organizer 2 uses this concept of a virtual file system, and essentially it's installing hooks into the game when it runs, and when a game asks for a file here, it hands it a completely different file. It's another way to go about it. Let's talk about the problems with each one of these approaches first. File copying copies the files into the game folders and is generally considered a bad practice, but why? Well, there's no undo of these uninstall, or a way to uninstall these mods, right? If you have A and then B and you want the other way around and there's two conflicts, well, you got to reinstall both mods to get the correct ordering of the files. There's no way to run the game without the mods except by deleting the game folder and starting over. You could go through and surgically delete every file, but if you've replaced a game file, you can't get that file back unless you backed it up. There's all sorts of problems, maybe even the game updates, and how do you deal with that, right? So another option is this hard or soft linking. Leverages a file system feature known as file links, where essentially you're taking a file here that's in this part, in this folder, and you're saying, the same data is also over here. It's kind of a cool concept. But there's lots of restrictions about this, depending on the operating system it's running on. Hard links in general don't work across disk boundaries or partition boundaries, which means if you have two disks, you can't link a file from one disk into the other. Soft links don't work on all platforms. Skyrim and at least not, I don't think it still does, but a lot of Bethesda games really kind of get tripped up on this sort of thing, that they aren't using quite the right OS function call to respect the soft link, and so they'll error or do something different when they encounter them. And modifying a hard link file modifies the original file. This is a really hard thing to explain, but if you have a file and it's linked to this folder and to this one, and now you replace the file here, it may or may not modify the original file. And that's because there is a difference in the logic of linking between opening a file, deleting the contents, and adding new contents. That's one way. The other way is to delete the file, recreate it, and put data into it. In the first approach, you actually modify the original file. You've linked the file into one folder, you've opened it up and changed the contents, that file is now changed. But in the second case, where you delete the file and recreate it, deleting the file kills the hard link to the original data. And so when you recreate it, you've created a new file. And Vortex has some detection of this, but really it's a really hard thing for users to understand, because it's not even necessarily the case that every tool the user will use that the developer thought about the impact this very small code change would make on an application, on this use case. And so it's just a really hard thing to explain, and good luck explaining that to a new user. The other problem here is that this still technically modifies the game folder. And the idea is you don't want to touch your game folder, but you're still touching the game folder even in this approach. You're just putting links into it instead of copying files. The final approach that has been used most often is a virtual file system. And in this case, this is what's used by Mod Organizer 2. And essentially, when it boots up the game or the tool you're using, it's going to rewrite function calls to open files, so that when it says, I want file A, you're handing it a completely different file, file B. And this keeps the folders mostly clean. We'll talk about that in a second. But one of the biggest problems here is that this approach looks a lot like malware. It's not malware. I want to make that clear. It's not malware, but it looks a lot like it, because essentially what it's doing is it's booting up an application and rewriting part of its code. And antivirus software sees that and says, whoa, what are you doing? This is pretty much the only legitimate software that does this, and so it kind of runs amok with some AV software. And this doesn't work very well for DLLs loaded by the operating system. SKSE, ENBs deal with this a little bit, and that they've kind of injected DLLs in that need to be loaded by the game, and they override some functionality in the game. But the operating system is the one loading that file. So in order to implement this properly, you would have to hook the operating system call that loads the file to route it somewhere else. And this is why you need things like Root Builder or copying files into your game folder in Mod Organizer to get them to work. Things like SKSE and ENBs. This may be hard to implement in Linux. It's maybe impossible on OS X, and if it's not impossible in OS X, it may be pretty soon, because more and more a lot of operating systems like OS X are moving to a model where they want apps to be more walled gardens, where the apps would define how they communicate themselves. And so if your game hasn't been set up to allow this sort of rerouting of the files, it's something we may run into more and more problems implementing. The other big thing is direct storage. So more and more games are starting to use direct storage, and you may or may not be familiar with this, but it's a concept whereby games can get hardware accelerated asset loading. If you're going to load a bunch of textures and a bunch of data for your game, there may be parts of your system that can take advantage of that. And I think over time we're going to see more and more parts of a PC support this idea of desktop storage. You may have a game accelerated hard drive that has a decompressor built into it. The more of games that move to direct storage, the harder it's going to be to reroute those function calls, because more of the functionality will move into drivers and into the operating system and into maybe even the hardware itself. And hooking that may not be possible, or it may have a massive performance impact. And all that means there's just a lot of technical risk. I wish this wasn't the case because I kind of like this approach for many reasons, but there's a lot of technical risk here. And it might be something that in a couple of years from now, these ideas of virtual file systems just stop working and there's no really good solution to it. So we went a different approach. This is the approach we take in the Nexus Mods app. And it's this idea of what if we could get the good parts of file copying without the bad, right? The bad parts of the file copying is you lose the tracking, the ability to track what's changed in your game folder over time. But what if we could still maintain that? We could still get the change tracking. Well, what we can do is we can hash every file in the game folder and then compare the hashes. Take a snapshot, if you will, of the game folder, and then after you run a tool or the game, take another snapshot. Compare the snapshots, see what's changed. Before you actually overwrite a file with the mod manager, back up that file, right? You could use these snapshots to roll forward and back. Say, oh, I ran the game, a bunch of stuff changed, I'm going to undo those changes. Remove everything that it did. Now we're back to where you were before you ran the game. If you've ever used Git, this looks a lot like Git, and at a top level, it is a lot like Git. Internally, there's a lot of differences, but at the top level, it's pretty close to the idea of Git. The idea that you could go back in time in history, that you can fork your loadout, the state of your game, and come back to it later, sort of an undo system. So that's what we're doing, is we're building a system like this. It's a pretty simple design. Essentially, you're hashing the files in the game folder and tracking them at various points. It works on any platform, as pretty much every game, you have access to a folder where that game expects files to be. Whether it's you're going to override the archives or add new textures or something like that. You're just copying files into a folder. There's no need for applications to run inside a mod manager. There's no need to explain to users what file links are. There's no OS level restrictions on where you can put your downloads or your install folders, or them all being on one disk. You could have a large hard drive on a USB sitting somewhere and then keep all your downloads on that and keep your game on your fast NVMe drive. The deployment time in this approach is the file copy time of the delta of the changes. And what this means is that we can reduce the deployment time down to the minimal amount of changes required to the game folder. So if you just installed a 4 gigabyte texture mod, we're going to have to put those 4 gigabytes in there. That's going to run at the speed it takes to extract and install 4 gigabytes of files. But if you install 2 of them and they only overlap on 2 files and you change the order, then we only need to update those 2 files. We can grab just those 2 files from the archive and put them right in where they need to be, and the deployment's pretty fast. That means we need really fast access to those files, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about this change tracking. We have the ability to snapshot our game folder and go forwards and backwards in time. We see a little mock-up of that here, the history of what you've done to your loadout. So what if we had a global level undo? What if we, right now mod managers allow us to easily enable and disable mods. It's the basic level. We can sort mods, that sort of thing. This is all dealing with the changes to the game folder. But what about the changes to your loadout? You can delete mods and make destructive changes to the game folder. But what about changes to the mods themselves? We often can't undo that. There's no way to undo changes to the files inside the mods. If we delete a mod, we can't get it back besides going back and reinstalling the mod. If we delete a mod, that means we have to reinstall it with the same settings. You got to go run that mod manager and make sure you click all the correct options the same way you did before, or something may have changed. If a tool deletes a whole bunch of files, you run a texture compressor, it errors out, a bunch of your files are gone. How do you get them back? So what we've built is a system that has a global undo. So you see here we have a list of fake loadout that I made. You create the loadout, you install a bunch of mods, and you can see on the right there you had 1 mod and then 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? So what we do is we track, obviously already we have to track the changes to the game file, or the game folder itself, but we can go back and forth between those changes. Each change, the loadout is logged in a history log, and we can go see that log. And then we can take either parts of that or parts of that previous history and forward them into the current version, or we could fork it and all sorts of other things. It's just data. It's data that says, hey, these hashes were in this folder at this time, and it's just a matter of manipulating that data to get back to where you want to be. Now, as I mentioned, all this hinges on the idea of having fast access to the files themselves. If you're going to pull those two textures out and put them in the game folder, you need them in a format that you can get at them easily. And also we realized if the application copy files into the game folder, there's no reason to have a staging folder or mod folders where everything's extracted all the time. We could keep these files compressed until the moment we need them. If we don't need them in the game folder, there's no reason to have them uncompressed. If the app is going to keep the files compressed, what format should we keep them in? So why not 7-zip, right? Everybody loves 7-zip. I don't, but it seems like everybody else does. So why not use 7-zip? Well, one of the reasons is 7-zip is a compatibility nightmare. It is a very strangely defined format. The source of truth for that format is in the 7-zip codebase itself. And it uses a large number of compression formats like LZMA2, which are very poorly supported outside of the official 7Z codebase. So if you ever see an app that can extract 7Z archives, if it's not using the actual 7-zip DLLs, there's probably some files out there that will just break with it. 7-zip is a solid format, which means that it takes all the files and puts them in a blob and compresses them all as one blob. That can result in some small sizes, but it makes random access really difficult. If you've ever installed a mod that's like a 6 gig mod of textures, right? And you open up the faux mod and you see like a little progress bar, and then the faux mod opens up. Or maybe you only selected 2 textures out of that 6 gigabytes and you hit install, and then you see it again. The little progress bar goes to here, extracting 2 files, continuing. The reason it does that is because all of those files are in one big chunk and it has to read from the beginning to get to the specific files you need. Also, some compression formats like LZMA2 are optimized for compression at the cost of almost everything else. I have seen LZMA2 be about 10 times slower for an extra 20% reduction in size, right? It's optimized probably for older internet, maybe where you're really concerned about bandwidth and transfer times and that sort of thing. But there's other ways of building formats, compression formats and archive formats these days that are better for the use cases we have. And solid formats are not very easily parallelizable. If you need to extract a whole bunch of files and you got to read from the beginning, that's kind of a single-threaded operation. And so trying to use multiple cores in this extraction process is not very easily done. So why not zip archives? Well, zip archives were originally designed as a format for tape backups, those giant cartridges that you'd put in a tape reader to back up, large amounts of data. That's what zip was designed for, way back when, a megabyte was a lot of data. Computers have changed a lot in these days, and there's a lot that could be optimized. And 7-zip just really doesn't take advantage of any of that. Zip also only supports one compression format normally, known as deflate. And deflate's not bad, and it's actually supported almost everywhere, except the speeds are kind of average. It's not an amazing format. There's better choices today. So why not RAR? RAR is simple. RAR is proprietary for compression, free for decompression, and it's not supported very well by open source libraries. And we're not going to use a proprietary, archive format for our app. So we built our own, called the NX format or the Nexus archive format. And actually, Sewer56 wrote this. I asked him to build something like this, and he went away for a while and came back with just a fantastic piece of software that I'm very happy with. So it's a new format designed specifically for the app, but it is open source and it's pretty self-contained. So if you want to use this anywhere, take a look at the repo. There's a fantastic set of docs on there that explains how to use it. There are multiple compression formats supported. We use LZ4, which is extremely fast. A Z standard is a format developed recently by Meta. I think it's slightly slower as LZ4, but it gets a little bit better compression ratios. They're pretty comparable though. And there's extension points for other formats. I think in the future we may start to see hardware accelerated compression, in which case that would be easy enough to slot in. It's a semi-solid format, meaning that We take small files and compress them into blocks. I think it's 1 to 16 megabytes of data we compress into a single block for the small files. For the larger files, we chop them up into chunks. And so if you have a 4 gigabyte file, you may break it up into 16 megabyte chunks, compress them individually, which means they can be decompressed individually, and that entire system works great with multi-core processors. So as I mentioned, small files are grouped and stored into solid blocks. Large files are chunked, and each chunk is compressed individually. And this allows for massive parallel extraction and compression. We also do what's called string pooling, which is where we take the names of the files inside the archives and we save them off in a different part of the archive and compress them as a single block. As it turns out, the app that we've built almost always refers to files by their hash code and not by the file name itself. And so we don't even have to decompress that data if we don't want it. And strings compress great when there's a whole bunch of strings together. So it's a win-win situation there. So this entire system results in a format that is extremely fast at decompression. It's roughly 4 gigabytes a second per core on a modern processor. That's compressing from memory into memory. So once you get disks involved, it's a little slower. It's more than capable of bottlenecking an NVMe drive though. Compression ratios are in line with other formats. It's about 4.4 times faster at decompression than 7-zip. It's about 5.8 times faster at compression than 7-zip, and with only about a 17% larger file size. And I performed this test on about 1.8 gigabytes of Skyrim textures and meshes. So this gives you an idea of kind of what you can expect. Slightly larger files than 7-zip with LZMA2 with massively faster support. In fact, on my system, I'm able to decompress that entire 1.8 gigabytes in 700 milliseconds. And this allows us to have almost instant access to any file inside an NX archive. We can decompress files on the fly, and it gives us the ability, and we've built this in the app, to have lazy, seekable, on-demand access to files. So the FOMOD mod manager or FOMOD installer that we've built, I use some images. You have the definition, the XML of the FOMOD. None of that is decompressed when you're doing the actual installer. We just pull the files out on demand. They're right there. We take an image out of the archive and feed the stream directly into the texture decompressor. So the entire library is open source GPL3. It's online. I have a link here. If you want to take a look at it, it's right there. Currently what we do is all of our downloads as they come from the Nexus are downloaded, decompressed into a folder. We then recompress them as an NX archive and then save that archive away and delete the 7-zip or the zip file that we've downloaded. There's no official support for NX archives on the Nexus servers yet. It would be nice to get that at some point, lower in priority. But I can imagine a situation where I mentioned, we have that streaming format, the streaming capability from the NX archive. And it's the type of thing where we could, in the future, instead of having you only extract those 2 textures out of the 6 gigs that you've downloaded, wouldn't it be great if you didn't even have to download that 6 gigabytes at all? You could just pull those 2 textures straight from the internet. Or, from that matter, you could load your entire FOMOD. You say, hey, I want to check out this mod. Boom, it loads the FOMOD. You go forward, and the FOMOD installer says, oh, we only need these 10 texture files. We're going to grab just those 10 texture files and save them off or put them in the game folder or something like that. And that's what I would like to move to eventually. Obviously, that requires a lot of support on the server side, so we'll see where that goes in the future. So those are the 3 main things that I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about the change system, how we deploy files, and the NX format. And I want to talk a little bit now about community involvement. We would love to have lots of people contribute to this project. The Nexus Mods app is open source, GPL3. We develop it. What you see on GitHub is what we're developing on. The branches are there every day. We try to make, trying to make commits as we create PRs. It's all right there. The discussions about it is all online. Contributions to all of this is very welcome. We're laying the foundation now for the UI and the game frameworks. The panel system that you saw before with the organization of the tools and stuff into workspaces, the work on that is done. We're just integrating that into the application right now. So we're trying to set a foundation that we can build the rest of the app on. There's going to be lots of room for contributions for new games, viewers, tools, texture viewers, model viewers, that sort of thing. We do have a diagnostic and warning system today, so you can create a rules-based system for attaching warnings and errors to mods and loadouts and files and that sort of thing. So what you can do is say, hey, you know what, here's a pattern, you're missing a master. Well, we can display that as a warning, a diagnostic warning in the loadout, and we just have to code that up as a set of rules. And this is a great way to codify the best practices for modding. We can kind of set this set of rules that can say, hey, here's what the community as in general has agreed is best practices. You know, deleted references, warnings, missing masters, that sort of thing. I just want to say, first of all, here that the support from the community so far has been fantastic. I've talked about the app on and off over the past year, and sounds like people are excited, and it's great to get that feedback. Developers who have decided to help have found that they can get .NET installed and the app built in about 15 minutes. There's no massive tool chains, multiple languages to install, anything like that. You basically install Rider or Visual Studio, hit build, and you're done. UI toolkits are always a pain. Avalonia is really no different. And so what we're trying to do is provide a standard theme, classes, and design for the app that then people can use to extend and develop their own tools in the app. We'll extend the framework. We'll give you a framework and allow you to extend that for the functionality you want to build out. So people have to learn less about the UI. In general, we're trying to create classes that provide a base set of functionality. Let's say a plugin sorting system. So we may have a window that has a plugin sorting system, and then you can extend that for Fallout or for Skyrim or other games, Baldur's Gate, Cyberpunk, that sort of thing. And you can add functionality to your specific game that you need and not necessarily require other people to adopt that same model. We already have 2 games contributed by the community. Bannerlord and Blade and Sorcery were not developed by us. They're developed by third parties, and now that they're in the code base, we take some responsibility for keeping that up to date as we make big code changes or
What do you suppose did this place in? The bombs? Or the people after the bombs?
As you'll piece together from both public and private terminals, we're in big shit here. The Overseer election is bullshit. Only Anderson can win. He's hiding a secret that goes back generations. The problem is, no one knows what that secret is. Hello, and welcome to this Vault-Tec approved orientation. If you're watching this, congratulations. You've been accepted as a resident for Vault 16. This orientation film was designed to help you prepare for a better life underground. Firstly, in the event of a real nuclear attack, please make haste to your vault. Once inside, please line up in an orderly fashion, as your overseer begins processing. You'll be escorted to your personal quarters by a member of staff in no time. All clothing is provided by Vault-Tec. You are to wear your Vault 16 jumpsuit, or approved alternatives at all times. Life will begin again. Remember to always listen to what your overseer says, as we at Vault-Tec have selected him or her for a reason. Thank you for watching this orientation film from Vault-Tec, and congratulations on being prepared for the future.
I come from a place far to the west.